One might argue that if the Alpha King had done a single competent thing with his reign, Marin never would have raised her hand to him. But then again, if a man lets his soldiers burn a border village and calls it unfortunate, someone has to be the one to remind him what a consequence feels like. So really, if one thought about it, the whole thing was his fault. All of it. Marin wasn't a noble, she wasn't even sworn to his court. She was the girl who'd spent 3 years rebuilding the Ashfen relief lines almost single-handedly, who could read a supply ledger for fraud faster than his own treasurer, who had buried her brother with her own hands after the raid nobody in the palace would answer for. She hadn't planned to attend the tribute ceremony. She'd planned to hand her petition to a clerk and leave, but then the king himself had stepped onto the dais, called the massacre at Ashfen regrettable, and thanked the crowd for their patience. Regrettable, patience. Her hand moved before the rest of her caught up. The crack of it echoed off the marble like a verdict. The whole hall went silent enough to hear the king's crown shift where he'd staggered sideways from the blow. Guards surged forward. Someone screamed for her arrest. Someone else screamed for her execution. Marin didn't move, didn't apologize, just stood there with her hands still stinging, waiting to be dragged away, already composing the letter she'd never get to send, explaining why it had been worth it. The king straightened slowly, touched his own jaw, and then, in front of the entire assembled court, in front of guards with weapons half-drawn and nobles frozen mid-gasp, King Ronan Valethorn dropped to one knee before her. "Thank you," he said. Chapter 1. The Court Holds Its Breath. For one full breath, nobody in the hall moved. Marin stood with her hands still raised, watching the most powerful alpha in the realm kneel in front of 200 witnesses, like she'd knighted him instead of struck him. "Rise, your majesty," someone finally choked out. One of his own guards, judging by the horror on his face. King Ronan Valethorn did not rise. He knelt there, jaw already darkening where her palm had connected, and looked up at her like she was the only person in the room worth looking at. "You struck your king," the guard tried again, weapon half lifted, clearly unsure whether to arrest her or apologize to her. "She did," Ronan agreed pleasantly, still kneeling. And she was right to. The silence that followed was worse than the slap had been. Marin's mind was already 3 steps ahead of her mouth, the way it always was. She catalogued exits, counted guards, calculated how many seconds she had before this went from strange to fatal. She'd spent 3 years keeping Ashfen's survivors fed on a supply line that shouldn't have worked. 3 years learning exactly how fast a room could turn on you. She knew the signs. This wasn't one of them, and that terrified her more than an arrest would have. "I don't understand," she said, because it was true, and because saying nothing felt more dangerous than saying that. "No," Ronan said, finally standing, dwarfing her the way alphas always seem to do without trying. "I don't imagine you do." He turned to the court before she could press further, his voice sharpening into something that carried to the back of the hall. "Ashfen was not a regrettable accident," he said. "It was a massacre ordered under my seal by someone in this room, who is not me. I have spent 4 months trying to prove that, without getting the person responsible for it killed before I could name them." His eyes came back to her. "You just did more to expose them in one slap than I managed in 4 months of careful diplomacy." Marin's stomach dropped somewhere past the marble floor. "Guards," Ronan said, not looking away from her. "Escort Lady Marin to my private study. Gently. And someone find Lord Advisor Corin. Tell him his king would like a word about the seal he apparently still has access to." Marin opened her mouth to object. The guards were already closing in around her, not to arrest her, to protect her. Chapter 2. The Impossible Situation. The private study was smaller than Marin expected for a king, all worn maps and half-finished correspondence, nothing like the gilded excess she'd imagined from the outside of the palace. She stood near the door because sitting felt like agreeing to stay. "You can't keep me here," she said. "I have a petition to file. I have a relief line to manage. I have—" A very long list of reasons to leave. "Yes, I gathered." Ronan dropped into the chair behind his desk, looking less like a king now, and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. "You also have the distinction of being the only person outside my personal guard who knows Ashvin was sabotage and not policy. That makes you a target the moment you walk out that door. That's not my problem. It became your problem the second you hit me in front of half my court. He said it without heat, almost fondly, which annoyed her more than anger would have. Corin has eyes everywhere. If he thinks you know enough to be dangerous, he won't wait for proof before he acts. Marin's jaw tightened. So what? I'm your prisoner now? Is that the gratitude? You're my guest, Ronan said, until I can determine how much you actually know and how to keep you breathing while I do. I know my brother is dead, she said, and the words came out sharper than she meant them to, sharper than she'd let them come out in months. I know a village got burned for a debt somebody else owed. I know you stood on that dais and called it regrettable, like it was a spilled drink. Something flickered across his face, not defensiveness, which she'd braced for, but something closer to shame. I know, he said quietly. I've known what that word cost people since the moment I said it. I said it anyway, because Corin was watching my face for exactly the reaction you just gave me, and I couldn't afford to give it to him yet. Marin stared at him, thrown by the honesty of it, unprepared for a king who admitted to failing on purpose. You could have told someone the truth, she said, quieter now. I'm telling you, he said. Right now, first person I've told. He almost smiled. You have a very memorable way of demanding honesty, Lady Marin. She didn't return the almost smile, but she didn't reach for the door again either. And that was the part that frightened her most. Chapter 3. Forced proximity begins. Guest, it turned out, meant something closer to contained. Marin was given rooms 2 doors from the king's own study, a guard posted at each end of the corridor, and absolutely no explanation for how long any of it was meant to last. When she demanded answers, Ronan gave her a title instead, temporary advisor to the crown on matters of Ashven relief, which meant she now had legitimate reason to sit in on council sessions she otherwise never would have seen. She told herself she stayed for the investigation, for her brother, for the truth Corin had buried under 4 months of careful paperwork. She did not tell herself the real reason she started noticing things about the king that had nothing to do with treason. He rubbed his left wrist when he was lying to the council about how close they were to finding Ashvin's culprit. He always let the youngest guards speak first in briefings, even when they had nothing useful to say, like he remembered what it felt like to be dismissed. And on the 3rd night, when she fell asleep at his desk, going through supply manifests, looking for the forged requisition that had funded the raid, she woke to find a blanket around her shoulders and the fire built back up, though she'd never heard him come in or out. You didn't have to do that, she told him the next morning, nodding at the blanket folded neatly on the chair. I didn't have to do a great many things, Ronan said, not looking up from his correspondence. I do them anyway. It's a character flaw. Kings aren't supposed to have those. I have several. Ask Corin. He's compiled a list. A dry, humorless smile. He'll be delighted to share it with you, right before he has you killed for asking. Marin studied him, really studied him, the way she used to study ledgers for the one line that didn't add up. There was something underneath the deflection, something he kept circling and never landing on. What is it you're not telling me? She asked. The pen stopped moving. There's a name in the forged requisition, he said finally, not meeting her eyes. One I haven't said aloud to anyone, not even Corin. Whose? He looked up at her then, and for the first time since the slap, he looked afraid. My brother's. Chapter 4. First Real Conversation. Marin sat down across from him without being asked, which felt, in that moment, like the smallest act of rebellion she'd committed all week. Your brother, she repeated. Half-brother. Desric. Ronan set the pen down like it had grown too heavy to hold. Our father never legitimized him, never gave him a title worth having. I did, the day I took the crown, because it seemed like the decent thing to do, and Desric thanked me for it in every way that mattered, right up until the moment his seal turned up on a requisition that funded the murder of an entire village. You think he did it? I think someone wanted me to believe he did it, Ronan said. Which is worse, in its own way, because now I don't know if I'm protecting my brother or protecting the man who framed him. Marin turned that over, the way she turned over every ledger that didn't balance. Corin manages the treasury seals. He'd know exactly how to forge a requisition that looked like Desric's. Corin has served this family since before I was born. Ronan's voice was tight now, the first real crack she'd seen in him. I don't want it to be him. I have spent 4 months not wanting it to be him, which is precisely why I haven't caught him yet. You're too close to see it clearly. It came out before she could soften it. I'm aware. Then let me look. She leaned forward. I've spent 3 years reading requisition forgeries for a relief line that half your nobility tried to starve out of spite. I know what a forged seal looks like under bad lantern light. Let me see the document. Something shifted in his face, not the careful mask he wore for the council, not even the guarded warmth he'd shown her over the fire and the blanket. Something rawer. If you find proof and it points to Desric, he said quietly, I need you to tell me, even if it destroys me. And if it points to Corin, then it will destroy me differently. He almost laughed, but there was no humor left in it. Either way, Marin, I'm asking you to hand me the knife. I'd like to know you'll actually let me use it. She held his gaze, surprised by how much the request cost him to make, and by how much she suddenly wanted to be worthy of being asked. Bring me the document, she said, tonight. Chapter 5. The Investigation. The document was worse than she expected. Marin spread it across the desk under 3 lanterns, tracing the seal with the edge of a blunted letter opener, the way she'd once traced fraudulent grain counts back to the noble who'd been starving Ashvin on purpose. Ronan stood close behind her, close enough that she was aware of exactly how close, which was a distraction she didn't have time for. Here. She tapped the wax impression. See how the crest sits slightly high on the left? A real seal presses evenly. This was stamped twice, once too light, corrected with a second, harder press. Meaning? Meaning whoever forged this doesn't have Desric's actual seal. They have a mold of it, probably taken from an old letter, maybe wax pressed into clay. She looked up at him. Your brother didn't do this, not directly anyway, but someone close enough to him to get an impression of his seal did. Relief moved through Ronan's whole body, visible even in the lantern light, before the second realization caught up with him, which means someone in his household, someone he trusts. Or someone in yours, Marin said carefully, who had reason to be near both of you. Neither of them said Corin's name. They didn't have to. Ronan straightened, and for a moment the king came back into his posture, the version of him she'd first seen on the dais, controlled and unreadable. I need to move carefully. If I accuse him without proof, he'll disappear before I can pull the whole thread. Then don't accuse him. Marin rolled the document carefully, protecting the seal impression. Let me find the mold. If it exists, it's somewhere in the Treasury archive, and I know exactly how to search a ledger room without anyone noticing I've been there. That's not your fight. My brother's name is on the casualty list from that raid, she said, quiet and hard. It became my fight the day it happened. You just gave me a way to actually do something about it, instead of filing petitions no one reads. Ronan studied her for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind his eyes. You terrify me a little, he admitted. Good, Marin said, already reaching for her cloak. Terrified men make fewer stupid decisions. She was nearly to the door when his hand caught her wrist. Not to stop her, she realized, but because he hadn't meant to reach for her at all, and hadn't managed to stop himself in time. Neither of them moved for a moment. Be careful, he said, voice rougher than before. Always am, she lied, and went to find the truth. Chapter 6. The Crack. The mold was exactly where Marin guessed it would be, pressed into a block of gray clay, hidden inside a false-bottomed ledger box in the Treasury archive, wrapped in cloth bearing Corin's household stitching. Proof enough to hang him if she could get it to Ronan without being seen. She almost missed the second document beneath it. A funding ledger, 3 months old, marked with the Crown's private seal, not Corin's, not Desric's, Ronan's own hand, line after line of Ashven relief funds, the same funds she'd spent 3 years fighting to keep flowing to the survivors, quietly diverted, not stolen. Redirected toward a private inquiry into the raid, toward exactly the investigation he'd told her, so earnestly, he'd been running alone. He'd been funding his secret out of her people's bread money the entire time. Marin sat on the archive floor with both documents in her lap for a long time before she made herself move. She found him in his study, still awake, still waiting for her the way he'd apparently been waiting every night she hadn't noticed. He rose when she entered, relief already breaking across his face at the sight of her, until he saw what she was holding. "I can explain the second one," he said quickly. "Can you?" Her voice came out flatter than she intended. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you took food out of the mouths of people who buried their families, because of your failure, to pay for keeping that failure quiet." "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was like, Ronan." She threw the ledger onto his desk. "Because I have spent 3 years rationing grain to widows so your treasury could balance, and this whole time you had money to spare for secrets." "I was going to replace every coin," he said, and she believed that he believed it. "I was protecting the investigation until I had proof strong enough to move on Corin without losing everything. You were protecting yourself." The words landed harder than the slap had. "I struck you in front of your whole court because I thought you were a coward who let people die and called it regrettable. I was starting to think I was wrong about you." He didn't argue, didn't reach for her, didn't do anything but stand there and let the silence confirm it. "I need to think," Marin said, already moving for the door. "Then think," Ronan said quietly, not following. "I won't stop you." She left him standing alone in the lantern light, and he let her go. Chapter 7. The Lowest Point. She didn't go back to her rooms. She went to the stables, saddled a horse that wasn't hers, and rode until the palace was a smear of torchlight behind her, and the anger had nowhere left to go but grief. She hadn't cried for her brother properly. Not once. Not in 3 years of ledgers and relief lines, and being too busy keeping other people's families fed to grieve her own. It came for her now, on the side of a dark road. All of it at once. Ashfen burning, the funeral she'd dug herself because there weren't enough hands left to help, and now this. The one man who'd looked at her like she mattered, revealed as just another crown spending her people's suffering to buy himself time. She didn't hear the riders until they were nearly on her. 3 of them, Corin's household colors half hidden under traveling cloaks, and she understood in the half-second before they reached her that the mold she'd stolen from the archive had already been missed. She ran. She was good at reading ledgers, not evading trained riders, and the gap closed fast. A hand closed around her cloak, wrenching her backward off the horse. And then a 4th rider crashed into the group like a landslide, and Ronan was there, sword already drawn, putting himself physically between her and the men sent to silence her before she'd even hit the ground. He hadn't waited for her to come back. He'd followed her the moment the guards reported her horse missing, unarmored, alone, because he'd rather risk his own life than lose the chance to explain. It was over fast. Corin's men weren't prepared for the king himself, and 2 fled while the 3rd was subdued at sword point, spilling everything within minutes. Corin's plan, the forged seal, the funds he'd meant to frame Desric for stealing. When it was done, Ronan knelt beside her in the dirt, checking her hands, her face, anything that might be hurt, with a desperation that had nothing to do with politics left in it. "I should have told you about the ledger the moment I diverted it," he said. "Not after. Not when you found it yourself in an archive, feeling like I'd lied to your face." "You did lie to my face." "I did," he agreed, no defense left in him. "And I understand if that's the end of it. I only needed to know you were safe first." Marin looked at him. Bloodied sword, torn cloak, no crown left on him at all in that moment, and understood, too late, exactly how much it may have already cost her to walk away. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. Corin was arrested before dawn, dragged from his private chambers still insisting his innocence, until Ronan set the clay mold and the diverted ledger side by side on the council table and let the evidence do what 4 months of caution never had. The full truth came out under questioning by midday. Corin had orchestrated Ashfen's destruction himself, using the raid to cover the theft of border tribute funds he'd been skimming for years, then forged Ezric's seal to make sure suspicion never landed anywhere near him. He'd counted on Ronan's loyalty to his brother, slowing the investigation just long enough to disappear with what remained of the stolen gold. He hadn't counted on a woman with a ledger reader's eye and a slap that echoed through the whole court. Merrin stood at the back of the council chamber through all of it, watching Ronan dismantle the man who'd murdered her brother with a composure she hadn't known he had left in him. When it was finished, when Corin had been led away in chains and the chamber had emptied, Ronan didn't go to his throne or his correspondence or anywhere a king was supposed to go. He came to her. "I diverted funds I had no right to touch," he said. "No counsel to perform for now, no crown weighing the words down. I let a village's grief pay for my own uncertainty, and I let you believe I was better than that, because it was easier than telling you the truth and watching you leave. I was wrong. About all of it. Except one thing." "Which one thing?" "Kneeling to you was the only honest thing I did in that entire ceremony." His voice roughened. "You saw exactly what I was. A man hiding behind... regrettable. And you made me face it in front of everyone I'd been too afraid to face it in front of alone. I have spent every day since trying to become someone who deserved that slap less. I don't know if I've managed it yet." Merrin felt the anger she'd been holding since the archive finally loosened its grip, not because he'd earned forgiveness with words, but because for the first time he wasn't asking her to simply believe him, he was asking her to decide. "You don't get to decide if you deserve it," she said. "I do. I know." She stepped closer, close enough to see the fading mark her own hand had left days ago. "Then I choose to stay. Not because you're a king, because you're finally telling me the truth even when it costs you." His breath left him like she'd struck him a second time, gentler now, and far more lasting. Chapter 9. The Resolution. The court reconvened 3 days later, not for a trial this time, but for what Ronan called, with uncharacteristic simplicity, correcting the record. Merrin stood beside the dais, rather than at the back of the hall. His doing, not her request, as he addressed the same assembly that had watched her strike him, the same nobles who'd screamed for her execution before he'd even risen from his knee. "Ashven was not regrettable," he said, and this time his voice didn't waver on the word. "It was murder, committed by Lord Corin against my own people to cover his theft, using my brother's name as a shield. Lady Merrin uncovered the proof I was too cautious to find myself. She lost her brother to this crime, and she has spent 3 years rebuilding what Corin tried to destroy. This court owes her more than an apology. It owes her a debt I intend to make certain is paid." He turned to her then, and Merrin felt the old doubt rise one last time, not about him, but about herself, about whether a girl who'd spent years being useful to survive actually belonged standing beside a throne instead of managing its ledgers from a careful distance. "You don't have to make this a spectacle," she said quietly, "just for him. I didn't do it to be thanked." "I know exactly why you did it," Ronan said. "That's precisely why it needs to be a spectacle. So no one in this hall ever mistakes your worth for something small again, including you." He didn't kneel this time. He reached for her hand instead, in front of the whole court, and pressed his mouth to her knuckles with a formality that somehow felt more intimate than anything private they'd shared. "Lady Merrin of Ashven," he said, loud enough to carry to the back of the hall, "will oversee the Crown's relief funds directly, answerable to no one but herself and me, and when she is ready, not before, I intend to ask her to stay permanently, not as an advisor." The murmur that swept the hall wasn't outrage this time. It was something closer to wonder. Merrin looked at him, the king who'd knelt for a slap he'd earned, who'd told her the truth even when it cost him everything, who was now offering her a future instead of an apology, and let herself believe, finally, that she could want this without it being taken from her. "Ask me tonight," she said, "when there's no court watching." Ronan's answering smile was the first one she'd seen that held no caution in it at all.